Welcome back, Myrmidons. I hope you've been enjoying the Greek Mythology Retold podcast. I have so many ideas and plans for future episodes, and I'd like to thank you for sticking with me. This is episode 8, continuing our exploration of the Wonder Women of Greek mythology with an in-depth look at Briseis in 2 parts. She was a princess and Achilles' prize slave, and somewhere along their journey, they became true lovers and heart companions. How did a slave, a war prize, end up as the wife of Achilles' heart? And how did she become the key to the civil war between Achilles and Agamemnon? Before I forget, I'd also like to tell you that I finally released the first 2 books of the Homeric Chronicles, Song of Sacrifice and Rise of Princes. This series is filled with all your favorite Greek mythological heroines and heroes. It's now available exclusively at Amazon, and it's free for Kindle Unlimited subscribers. Let's get started on our next Wonder Woman, Briseis, also known as Hippodamia. Well, who was she, and where did she come from? How did she become the pivotal figure in the midst of the greatest war and civil war of the Homeric world? Why are we so fascinated with her? How did she become the love interest of the most notorious Greek hero who ever lived? There's so much mystery surrounding her. It's a goldmine, really, for historic fantasy writers. Briseis features as a prominent character in several books: Song of Achilles in 2011, Hand of Fire 2014, Song of Sacrifice 2016 and 2018, For the Most Beautiful 2017, and most recently, Silence of the Girls. To truly understand who Briseis was and how she fits into the Trojan War narrative, we need to return to the established timeline and comb through the sources. If you haven't already listened to the first 3 episodes on how and why I built the chronology of major events, you might want to go back at some point and give those a listen. They're the shortest episodes and will help you make sense of how all these myths are woven together. Here's a brief recap. The Homeric Chronicles timeline begins in 1295 BCE with the birth of Hector, the crown prince of Troy. The pivotal event of Helen's supposed kidnapping is set at 1251 BCE. Homer doesn't provide a timeline for any of this or the 9 years prior to dropping us directly into the story of Achilles' rage against Agamemnon. Homer ends his story with Achilles' epic showdown with Hector and the return of Hector's body to Troy. We do, however, have access to pieces of other Trojan War stories beyond the Homeric texts, and I'm going to come back to this, so hold that thought. My research on Briseis took quite a journey, where I thankfully discovered Dr. Casey Douay's books about multiformity of Iliadic texts. Her work on Briseis' lament for Patroclus was particularly intriguing for me, and how understanding Briseis' part in the Trojan War story requires looking not just at what is attributed by Homer, but at all the other available sources, even those echoes between the lines of perhaps older traditions of the Trojan War mythology. This is a common theme, isn't it? That we discover the women's voices between the lines of what's spoken or unspoken by the men through the whispers and echoes of Homer and other sources. And that is where we hear the heroines' stories. Dr. Douay's work really blew me away because I never thought about how Homer's version wasn't the only or the best version, and what that could mean for the overall story we know and that I base my work on. I'll put Dr. Douay's links in the YouTube description of this podcast when I upload it. Back to Homer. The epic battle and fall of Troy isn't recorded in the Iliad because the story is really about Achilles' unstoppable rage. We do get the ferocious fighting between Patroclus and Hector and Achilles and Hector, but for us readers, it's like skipping the battle at Mordor's gates in Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, and going straight to Aragorn being crowned King of Gondor, or George R.R. Martin skipping the final showdown between Jon Snow and the Night King, and going directly to who, if anyone, sits on the Iron Throne. Homer drops us into the explosive argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, signaling the beginning of the end of the 9 long years of siege warfare in the Troad and against Troy itself. Now that I think about it, the only battle that was shown on screen coming close to what's written was maybe Brad Pitt and Eric Bana fighting as Achilles and Hector. I personally wasn't satisfied with the Patroclus and Hector fight, nor the Paris and Menelaus fight, if you can even call that a fight with Paris crawling away in the dirt. Getting to Briseis is obviously requiring some background here. Barry Strauss, in his book The Trojan War, discusses the areas and cities the collective Greeks plundered and conquered. In Chapter 5, titled The Dirty War, he focuses on the raids and battles of Thebes under Plakos, Lyrnessus, and Pedasus. Now bear with me here, because Briseis' part of the story hinges on when and what Achilles does during this time. Dr. Strauss confirms that Achilles had sacked numerous towns by the time he reached that far south of Troy, with more conquest to come, as the Greeks, unable to breach the Great Wall of Troy, continued targeting the outlying Trojan allies and towns. Achilles himself tells us about his many raids when he insults Agamemnon for being a hang back and watch others do his fighting kind of king. Dr. Strauss also states that we really have no idea the order of when these dozens of towns were taken. But remember, as a storyteller, I've got 9 years of this pirating and raiding going on before we get to the opening of the Iliad and Achilles' big argument, resulting in what's really the civil war with Agamemnon. What does all of this have to do with Briseis? During this 9-year period, for which we have no chronological account from Homer or anyone else, Achilles has at some point acquired a war prize named Briseis after the battle at Lyrnessus. Women of standing who were deemed of great beauty were often given as prizes to the winning warriors. This is really a nice way of saying women were raped and or forced into sexual slavery, servicing their new owner and often bearing his bastards. In the Bronze Age, this was the acceptable and dreaded outcome of war. You'll recall from the Andromache episode how she and Hector both voiced their fears of her enslavement if he should fall in battle. If you haven't listened to it, you might want to go back and give it a go, because there are some really striking parallels between Andromache and Briseis. Being a war prize meant that you survived, but your body and your freedom, such as you had it, no longer existed as yours. Captive women such as Briseis also performed the domestic chores in the Greek camp, mending and laundry, food preparation and cooking, and child care. We have no idea how many children were the product of the Greek warriors and their Trojan ally slaves, but certainly there were many after 9 years. I'd like to step away from the Bronze Age for a moment to talk about children of war, as this is an aspect of war that rings as true today as it did thousands of years ago. Children are a natural product of sexual relations, even in war, and often during war a product of rape, sometimes relationships. So when I envision this 9 years of siege warfare, thousands of men far from home, likely hundreds or thousands of women taken as captive and given out as prizes for the Greeks to do with as they pleased, likely produced many children who were born by these captive women. And this is the group that Briseis belonged to, the war prizes used as concubines and sexual slaves. The mystery surrounding Briseis beckons us, doesn't it? How did she go from slave to cherished lover and wife, important enough to cause Achilles great suffering when parted from her? Enough that he seriously considers slitting Agamemnon's throat at the mere suggestion that she might be taken from him. But hang on, I'll get to that. Some of the information we have about Briseis is conflicting, and that's due to the fluid oral tradition of the Trojan War mythology and understanding that the Iliad is really a compressed version of a much larger story. This is what I alluded to earlier that actually blew my mind. In Chapter 1 of her work on Briseis, Dr. Douay writes, "In an oral traditional song culture, such as that in which the Iliad and Odyssey were composed, each new performance is a new composition. In such a system, there can technically be no original from which all others are copies. In fact, it is misleading to think of versions that differ from the Iliad as we know it as, quote, variants. If, for lack of a better word, we use the term variant, we must acknowledge that the Iliad is itself a variation on any number of ways to tell a story about Troy, and that within the Iliad itself there are references to other variants. In the Iliad, Briseis is named Briseis, and she was captured by Achilles in the sack of Lyrnessus. In another and other versions of the story, Briseis is named Hippodamia and was taken from Pedasus. The Iliad is not only a variant in its own right, it's also a compression. Okay, so what this means is that there was possibly a huge collection of Trojan War stories circulating before, during, and after Homer. Homer simply smashed what he could together. It would be something like taking the entire HBO story of Game of Thrones that we know it up to this point and forcing it into a trilogy. Some highlights would be there, we'd recognize them, and some other storylines would be left out. A trilogy format would force a compression of a massive story into a workable frame. I found this enlightening and really a bit liberating. Within these variations on Briseis, there is some consensus, and at the very least, an understanding that sometimes as a storyteller, you have to make choices. The consensus about Briseis is that she was a noblewoman married to Mynes of Lyrnessus, either the prince or a king, with my choice being making him a prince. After Achilles attacked Lyrnessus, Briseis was widowed and taken as the ruthless killer's war prize. One of the medieval scholars, Eustathius of Thessaloniki, in his Homeric commentaries, says that Briseis of Pedasus was Briseis' father and a priest of Apollo like his brother Chryses in the city of Chrysae. Pedasus and Chrysae are both south of Troy along the Bay of Edremit. I find this particularly interesting because that would make the two women Achilles and Agamemnon fight over cousins, mirroring the cousin relationship of Helen and Penelope. Why should we consider a religious scholar from the early 12th century? Because many of the works he utilized and referenced in his writings are now lost to us. So he's a link to the Homeric past that we're trying to piece together. If Briseis is from Pedasus, then so too is his daughter, Briseis. There's no mention of who Briseis' mother is, so as fiction writers of the Trojan War, we have to invent her. In the Homeric Chronicles, I named her Shavash. When writing Briseis' character for the Homeric Chronicles, I tried to balance her life with women's experiences during the Bronze Age. And even though it's mythology, I add that bit of history because it is a historical time period. I balanced that against what we might think of modern women. I wanted to create an ancient woman whose struggles and triumphs, loneliness and passion, weaknesses and inner strength resonated with modern women about being a woman. A heroine as flawed and as complicated as any of the heroes of Greek mythology, especially Achilles. The women in the Homeric Chronicles are resourceful, resilient, and defiant even as they face the realities of war, becoming objects of violence by the gods and at the hands of men, and endure being chattel, bargained away in marriage for familial and community benefit. It's what makes the women I'm writing about the Wonder Women of Greek mythology, really. Their mothers, daughters, wives, navigating a patriarchic society with grace and sometimes stumbling along the way, learning and adapting to life. Because really that humanizes these mythological characters, men and women, Neither they nor us possess guidance manuals for life. With that said, to give Briseis the layers of humanity she deserves and create a dynamic figure that would become the spark of civil war between Achilles and Agamemnon, I had to invent her childhood, fill in the gaps of her life by participating in the creation of her mythology. The earliest story I wrote of Briseis was when she was still in her mother's womb. I also took the liberty of making her parents minor royalty, King Briseis and Queen Shavash. Pedasus is a vassal of sorts, an ally of Troy. Like all the more famous or infamous characters, Briseis deserved a prophecy. In Song of Sacrifice, I write, Priam watched from the corner of his eye as the queen took her leave of the feast, Hector talking all the way with the wife of Briseis. "She's an easy woman, your wife," Priam remarked to his royal dinner companion. Briseis raised a perfectly arched eyebrow at Priam's assessment. "Don't let her soft voice and manner deceive. The blood of my wife's family breeds fierceness and hot tempers. She's not so easily bent to a husband's will as you may think." Priam's drunken laughter shook the table, splashing his wine. The dry planks drank the red liquid. He clapped Briseis firmly on the back. "It appears, my friend, that our taste in horses and women is the same. The untamable ones tempt the most." "True enough, King Priam. I fear the daughter she carries will be the undoing of me." "How do you know it is a daughter and not a sturdy son?" "Apollo has spoken the sacred word that it is so." Priam bristled at the mention of Apollo. "The god's word was favorable regarding the child?" Briseis nodded. "The girl child will marry the greatest warrior that ever lived." Priam clasped his guest's arm. "Then, by all means, she should marry Hector." "Nothing would please me more," Briseis said, as they raised their wine in salute and drank. The king handed his drinking cup to a slave, signaling across the chamber to another slave. "No more talk of horseflesh and women. Bring the dancers." He settled back into his chair as the veiled women swirled into the room. Their swaying bodies undulated to the bells and drums, while Priam's foggy mind drifted to Hecuba. It may have been many years since she'd enthusiastically wrapped her long legs around him in ecstasy, but he still throbbed at the memory. We know it's supposed to be Achilles, but the Trojans have never heard of him. In fact, he hasn't even been born yet. Linking Briseis to Achilles' greatest enemy in the Homeric Chronicles adds a touch of irony to her overall story arc, in my assessment. Also, a young woman of her station would likely have been betrothed and married off young. In the Song of Sacrifice, we see Briseis' first meeting with Hector and her mother's stern reprimand, reminding us clearly of women's place in the patriarchic society of the Bronze Age. I hope this isn't too spoilery, but anyway, this is from chapter 22. Briseis fussed with her gown. "I don't like the color, mother." She scratched at the golden belt. "It brings out the pale of your eyes. It's a fine blue dye, very costly. Your father searched high and low for such a treasure." Shavash cupped her daughter's cheek. "I've dreamt of this day since I carried you beneath my heart." "I don't care about Chryses' prophecy. I don't want to marry a warrior." "A prince, Briseis. Hector is the prince of Troy. There is no more worthy man than he." "He's old." "Wise." Briseis wrinkled her nose. "Old, wise. What if he's hairy? Stinks of horse." Shavash laughed. "Daughter, you needn't worry about such matters. He's said to be the most handsome. He was a lovely boy, as I recall." "If you say so." Briseis gave a final tug at her gown. "Can we get this over with?" "Smile." "I don't want to smile." Shavash sighed heavily. Moving to her daughter's side, she grabbed Briseis firmly by the chin. "Marriage isn't about what we want as women. It's about what we provide to our husbands and our cities. The men plant their seeds in our bodies, and we bear the fruit of their legacy." She squeezed tighter. "It's the way of our world. If you're blessed with a kind and handsome husband, bear him many children. Consider yourself blessed by the gods. Fight this, and you will surely be cursed, and not just by the gods, but by your father and your mother." The young princess of Pedasus stared into her mother's hard eyes. Her chin quivered in her mother's tight grasp. Her lips moved awkwardly as she said, "I obey." Shavash released her grip, returning once again to the doting mother. "Good. See, you are more ready to be a wife than you realized." Briseis is, according to consensus, later married to Mynes, a crown prince of Lyrnessus. There is no mention of their children, so it seemed likely to me that her experience with motherhood mirrored Andromache's. This is important because, as you'll see later, their laments at the deaths of their husbands also mirrors each other, which gave me a little insight into Briseis and Achilles' relationship. When people think of women who can't, quote, have children, they perhaps envision a woman who never gets pregnant, a barren womb, if you will. But oftentimes, and more to reality, there's a different experience. Sometimes a woman is able to get pregnant but suffers from miscarriages, and with each pregnancy, a hope arises only to be dashed. This is not only emotionally traumatic, but physically traumatic. I've written both Andromache and Briseis going through this kind of heartbreak as part of their motherhood experience, because it's something that women have been going through since the beginning of time, and that it also mirrors their other grief, the death of their respective husbands. Their suffering adds a complex layer of humanity to their characters, mirroring the struggles of women around the world and through time. We see how these common stories shape their visions of the future and their understanding of the fleeting nature of joy. In a time of extended warfare, this is a powerful motivation to preserve loved ones and contemplate all the what-ifs. Because if Briseis is a princess and a part of her wifely duty was to provide an heir for Lyrnessus, a handmaiden was eventually introduced. The very thing that I had Andromache fear was Briseis' reality. And this was the only way I could really explain how Briseis and Mynes and Briseis and Achilles aren't noted with children in any sources. We've come to the end of part 1. So far, we've established Briseis was a princess of Lyrnessus and previously married to the crown prince Mynes of Lyrnessus, likely married off at a young age. She has no recorded children by Mynes or Achilles. Her mother is unknown, and her father is Briseis, who was probably a southern ally of Priam. Briseis was a prized possession and later love interest of Achilles. Remember to head over to my YouTube channel and post any comments or questions you have about this episode on that platform, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. As always, I'll leave the source links below the video. Pick up a copy of my books if you want more Greek mythology and Trojan War epicness. As I drink my wine this time, I raise my glass to my father Thomas, who recently lost his battle with gallbladder cancer. I love you, Daddy, and I'm going to keep writing and get to Italy like we always talked about. I know you're with me, cheer me on in spirit. So, drink your wine and be merry.